a man and a white wolf. They were more than man and beast. They were a family, two broken souls surviving in the quiet solitude of the mountains. But then, the man broke their silent pact. He brought home a new joy, a small golden puppy that made him laugh for the first time in years. He cuddled the new life, while his old, faithful partner was pushed out into the cold rain. Betrayed, replaced. The wolf's heart was shattered. But what the man didn't know was that death was stalking his cabin that very night, and the fate of everyone he held dear now rested in the paws of the one he had just abandoned. The rain in Oregon's coastal range was not a visitor, it was a resident. It fell with a quiet insistence, a steady sound against the shingles, turning the world beyond Mark's cabin into a watercolor of blurred greens and deep, wet browns. For 3 years, this curtain of water had been his shield. The cabin itself, built with his own hands, was less a home than a fortress against a world that had moved on without him. Inside, the air smelled of cedar shavings and coffee. Mark worked at his bench, his flannel sleeves rolled to the elbows. The pull of the handsaw against the piece of maple was a familiar, grounding rhythm. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with a carpenter's precision. He was a man of 40, but the grief he carried had etched lines into his face that belonged to someone much older. He worked, he read, he drank his coffee, and he existed within the quiet borders of his self-imposed exile. He was not, however, entirely alone. A white shadow shifted by the doorway. Ghost. The wolf was enormous, a creature of snow and mist that seemed more at home in the Arctic than in the damp Oregon woods. His paws made no sound on the wooden floorboards. He moved to the hearth, not for the warmth. The fireplace was cold stone, unused since the accident, but for the place itself. Ghost's amber eyes watched Mark. They were not the loyal, domesticated eyes of a dog, waiting for a command. They were the eyes of a mirror, holding the deep, patient understanding of the wild. And in them, Mark saw his own solitude reflected. He had found Ghost 3 winters ago, a half-dead cub shivering beside its frozen mother, victim of a blizzard that had swept down from the mountains. Mark, hollowed by his own loss, had looked at the small, dying creature and felt the first flicker of purpose in months. He had scooped it up, tucked it inside his jacket, and brought it back. He had saved its life. In return, Ghost had saved his. The wolf was the only witness to Mark's grief. He was the only one present for the nights when the silence in the cabin became a physical weight, heavier than the rain-soaked sky. Nights when Mark's hands, so steady with a saw, would tremble as they held a framed photograph. A woman's bright laugh, a child's gap-toothed smile. Ghost would not whine or paw for attention. A dog would have tried to cheer him, to lick away the tears. Ghost simply knew. He would rise from his place on the small braided rug, pad across the floor, and rest his great, heavy head on Mark's knee. It was a silent acknowledgement. I am here. You are not alone. The rug itself was a talisman. It was the last thing Mark had bought for his daughter, Sarah. It had been meant for her bedside. Now, it was Ghost's place, his anchor. This was their family, born not of blood, but of shared loss and the quiet understanding that some wounds never truly heal. They were 2 broken souls existing in the silence between. The sound of the rain was their only song, and the steady breath of the wolf in the dark was Mark's only lullaby. He finished the cut on the maple, the wood falling away clean. He nodded, satisfied. He wiped his hands on a rag, and his eyes met the wolf's across the room. No words were needed. They were a complete world, just two of them, protected by the mountains and the rain. It was, Mark believed, all he would ever need. The sound, when it came, was so alien that Mark flinched, his hand tightening on the saw. It was not the rain or the wind, or the distant call of an eagle. It was the complaint of tires on wet gravel, the sound of a small, overworked engine fighting the incline of his driveway. Ghost was on his feet before the sound had fully registered in Mark's mind. The white wolf moved from the hearth to the door in a single, silent flow of muscle. He did not bark. He simply stood, a living shadow, his body blocking the entrance as he stared into the gray mist. A blue Subaru, mud-splattered and looking profoundly out of place, emerged from the trees. The engine cut off, plunging the world back into silence, but the tension remained. The car door opened and a woman emerged, pulling her city coat tight against the damp. Laura, Mark's older sister. "Mark," she called out, her voice too bright, too loud for the space. "My God, do you ever plan on paving this road? I thought I was going to lose a tire." Mark set his saw down and wiped his hands on his jeans. He felt the familiar, uncomfortable pull of the outside world. He stepped onto the porch. "Laura, you should have called. And let you tell me not to come?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She was a woman of lists, of schedules, of fixing things. Mark, in his fortress of rain and wood, was the one thing she could not organize. Her eyes landed on Ghost, who had not moved an inch. "Oh," she said, her smile freezing. He's still here. He's bigger than I remember." "He lives here, Laura," Mark said quietly. "Right. Of course." She gave the wolf a wide berth as she stepped onto the porch, bringing with her the scent of perfume and exhaust. "Well, aren't you going to invite your only sister in?" The cabin felt smaller with her in it. She moved with a nervous energy, taking in the single mug, the dusty books, the unfinished projects. Her gaze lingered on the hearth, on the braided rug where Ghost now sat, watching her every move. "Mark," she began, unbuttoning her coat. "It's been 3 years. This isn't living. This is just waiting. The silence. It's not healthy." "I'm not unhealthy," Mark said, his voice flat. He went to the kitchen counter to pour a coffee he didn't want. "You're alone. That's not Ghost's fault," she added quickly, glancing at the wolf. "He's a beautiful animal, Mark. But he's an animal. He's not Sarah." The name landed in the room with a physical weight. Mark's back tensed. "Don't!" "I have to." Laura's voice cracked, the frustration breaking through. "I'm worried about you. I came here to help." She turned and marched toward the small hallway that led to the bedrooms. "I'll start by airing this place out. It smells like..." She pushed open the second door, the one that was always kept closed. Sarah's room. It was just as it had been left, a time capsule of pink paint and stuffed animals. A sound, more of a vibration, started deep in Ghost's chest. It was not a growl. It was the sound of a tectonic plate shifting, a low thoracic rumble that made the air in the cabin feel thin. He rose from the rug, the fur along his spine standing up. Laura froze. "Ghost." "No," Mark commanded. His voice was sharp. The wolf's rumble subsided, but he did not sit. He moved, placing his body squarely in the doorway of the small room, a clear and final barrier. Laura looked from the wolf to her brother, her face pale. "This is what I'm talking about, Mark. You're living in a mausoleum, guarded by a wolf. This isn't right." She stayed for another hour. The conversation was strained, full of long silences that even the rain couldn't fill. Finally, she sighed, defeated. "I'm going," she announced. "But I brought you something. It's in the car. Don't argue. Just humor me." Mark followed her back out into the damp air. She opened the back of her Subaru. Next to her suitcase was a small plastic pet carrier. "Laura, no," Mark said. "Absolutely not." "Just look at him, Mark," she pleaded. "I know Ghost is your guardian, your partner. But he's so heavy. He's so quiet. He's just like you." She unlatched the carrier door. "I thought maybe you needed some noise. Maybe you needed something that isn't broken." A small, clumsy, golden ball of fur stumbled out onto the wet gravel. It was a puppy. A golden retriever, perhaps 8 weeks old, all paws and unfocused energy. It blinked in the gray light, let out a high-pitched, squeaking sound, and immediately tried to chew on the muddy tread of Mark's boot. Mark was frozen. He stared at the tiny creature, a chaotic, innocent ball of life that had no place in his world of silence. "His name is Buster," Laura said, her voice soft. "Just try. For me." She got in her car, not waiting for an answer. The Subaru's engine turned over, and she disappeared back into the mist. Mark stood on the driveway for a long time, the rain starting to soak his flannel. The puppy let out another small, confused cry and pawed at his leg. And from the porch, silent as stone, Ghost watched. His amber eyes were fixed on the small, golden creature. He watched as Mark, with a heavy sigh, finally bent down and picked up the new arrival. The rain had stopped, but a new storm was just beginning. The cabin door closed with a quiet click, sealing Mark in with the 2 things he had not asked for: the rain and this new, chaotic creature. The puppy, Buster, stood dripping on the doormat, trembling. He looked impossibly small and intensely golden against the dark, worn wood. He let out a small, high-pitched cry. That sound, so thin and needy, perforated the deep, resonant silence that Mark and Ghost had cultivated for 3 years. The cabin's quiet was a thick blanket. This new sound was a needle. Ghost, who had remained on the porch, pushed the door open with his nose and padded inside. He was a creature of the wild, and he carried the scent of wet pine and ozone with him. He shook his massive white body once, sending a spray of cold rainwater across the floor. He paid no attention to the puppy. He simply walked to his place, the braided rug, lay down, and watched Mark. His amber eyes were unblinking, patient. The puppy, however, was not patient. It was a bundle of frantic, untamed energy. It stumbled, yelping, across the floor. It sniffed Ghost's tail, received a low, almost subsonic warning from the wolf's chest, and scrambled away in a panic. It discovered the leg of Mark's workbench and began to chew on it. "Hey!" "No," Mark said, his voice rusty. He moved the puppy. It immediately fell into a puddle of water it had dripped, let out another sharp cry, and began to shiver violently. Mark stared at it. This was Laura's gift, a problem that needed to be solved. He sighed, the sound heavy with frustration, and went to the hallway closet. He pulled out an old towel. It was soft, worn, and had small, faded cartoon bears on it. He rubbed the puppy dry, his movements rough but efficient. The puppy, now fluffy and mostly dry, looked up at him and whimpered, its whole body still shaking from the chill. Mark looked from the shivering puppy to the hearth, the cold, dark brick where no fire had burned for 3 years. It was the center of their silence, the monument to his loss. Ghost lay on the rug beside it, content in the cold. "Damn it, Laura," Mark whispered. He went to the woodpile by the door, his movements stiff. He took 3 logs of dry oak. He knelt at the hearth. The scrape of the kindling, the strike of the long match, felt like a betrayal. Ghost lifted his head, his ears forward. The sound was alien. The fire caught. A small, hungry flame licked at the wood, and for the first time in 1,095 days, warmth began to radiate from the fireplace. The light flickered, casting moving shadows on the walls, breaking the cabin's long, still gloom. The puppy, drawn by the sudden warmth, stumbled toward the growing light and curled up on the stones, as close as it could get. It was still shaking. Mark watched it. He felt nothing, he told himself. Just annoyance. But the creature was so small. It looked so breakable. He turned away and walked to the corner of the room, to the one piece of furniture he never touched, the old wooden rocking chair. His wife, Anna, had loved this chair. He had built it for her, to rock their daughter. It had sat facing the cold hearth, silent for 3 Lents. His hand rested on the smooth, worn arm. He looked at the fire. He looked at the puppy. He looked at Ghost, who was watching him with an intensity that felt like a judgment. Then slowly, Mark sat down in the rocker. The wood protested with a low, aching sound. The puppy heard the movement and let out another small, pleading cry. Mark looked at it. He got up, scooped the small golden creature from the hearth, and sat back down. He did not intend for it to happen. But the puppy was cold, and he was warm. It scrambled up his flannel shirt and burrowed against his chest, seeking the beat of his heart. It sighed, a long, trembling exhalation, and was instantly asleep. Mark's hand, the same hand that could guide a saw through unyielding oak, came up and rested on the puppy's small back. He felt the tiny ribs rise and fall. He felt the warmth, and, without conscious thought, his body began to move. The rocking chair moved back and forth. Back and forth. That was the moment Ghost chose to rise from the rug. He walked across the room, as he did every night, for the silent ritual, the moment when he would rest his head on Mark's knee. He stopped a few feet away. He saw it all. He saw the fire, a bright, loud stranger in their quiet home. He saw the rocking chair, the sacred, untouched object, moving. And he saw his master, his partner, his entire world, cradling the new creature. He saw Mark's hand, the hand that had saved him, now protecting this new, small thing. Ghost had never seen Mark hold anything like that. Not since before. He did not growl. He did not move forward. He simply stood, a white specter in the new, flickering light. His heart, a wild thing that had learned to trust one man exclusively, felt as if it had cracked open, like ice under a sudden weight. The question was there in his unblinking amber eyes, a silent scream into the changed room. Am I not your family? Mark, lost in a memory, did not see him. The wolf's heart broke. He did not make a sound. He simply backed away, one silent step at a time. He turned, his paws padding softly on the wood floor. He walked past his rug, the one that had been his only anchor, and pushed the cabin door open with his nose. He stepped out onto the porch, into the cold, driving rain. He did not stop at the edge. He walked down the steps, past the woodpile, and lay down in the mud, letting the storm wash over him. The cold was a comfort. It was the only thing that still felt real. The rain had stopped by morning, but the sky remained a bruised, heavy gray. Mark woke with a start in the rocking chair, his neck stiff, his back aching. For a disorienting second, he didn't know what had woken him. Then he heard it, a sharp, insistent series of cries. Buster was awake. The fire had died, leaving the cabin cold again. The puppy was scrambling at the edge of the hearth, having made a small, wet mess on the stone. Mark groaned, pushing himself out of the chair. His first thought was coffee. His second was cleaning up the mess. He was wiping the stone with a rag when Ghost pushed the door open. The white wolf was caked in mud, his fur matted and dark from the long night in the storm. He stood at the threshold, a wild, sorrowful figure, and looked at Mark. "Outside," Mark said, not unkindly, but his voice was tired. He was pointing at the puppy. "You, go outside." He nudged Buster out the door and grabbed the bag of new puppy food Laura had left. He fumbled with the bag, pouring the small pellets into a spare bowl. Ghost padded to his own bowl by the counter, expecting the usual ritual. The quiet morning greeting, the fresh water, the piece of jerky Mark saved for him. Mark, distracted by the puppy's renewed crying on the porch, just dumped a scoop of dry kibble into Ghost's bowl without looking. "Eat up," he muttered. It was the same food he'd given him for 3 years, but the ceremony was gone. The connection was broken. Ghost looked at the food, then at Mark's back. He did not eat. The day was a series of small, sharp betrayals. Mark needed to drive into town for supplies. More cleaning spray, a leash, the correct food. He went to his old truck, the engine turning over with a cough. Buster, who could not be left alone, was placed on the passenger seat, bundled in the bear print towel. That seat had always been Ghost's. It was the co-pilot's chair, the vantage point from which wolf and man had surveyed their quiet kingdom. Ghost waited by the driver's side door, his amber eyes expectant. "You're too muddy, boy," Mark said, his hand on the door handle. "And there's no room. You stay. Watch the house." He closed the door. Ghost stood motionless as the truck rumbled down the gravel path. The small, golden head of the puppy visible in the window, where his own head should have been. He did not howl. He just watched until the sound of the engine was swallowed by the trees. When Mark returned, the cabin was invaded by new, alien objects. A squeaking rubber chicken, a small circular bed that Mark placed on the braided rug. Sarah's rug, Ghost's rug. The wolf would no longer lie on it. He retreated to the far corner of the cabin by the drafty window and lay on the cold, bare floorboards. From here he watched. He watched Mark, a man he had only ever known in shades of gray and silence, suddenly become a creature of frantic motion. Mark was constantly cleaning, constantly fetching, constantly talking. He used a high, strange voice for the puppy. "Who's a good boy? Are you a good boy?" Ghost had never needed words. His bond with Mark was deeper, forged in the unspoken. Now, the cabin was filled with this meaningless chatter, this praise heaped upon a creature that did nothing but make messes and noise. The final cutting moment came that evening. The new fire was blazing in the hearth. Mark was on the floor trying to teach Buster to sit. The puppy, clumsy and excited, kept tumbling over its own paws. On the third try, it rolled onto its back, paws in the air. And Mark laughed. It was not a chuckle. It was a real, short, rusty laugh that burst from his chest. It was a sound Ghost had not heard in 3 years. Not once. It was the sound of the man who had existed before the accident, the man Ghost had never known. And it was not for him. The laugh echoed in the small cabin, sharp as breaking glass. Ghost felt it like a physical blow. This small, foolish creature had done in 2 days what he had not managed in 3 years. It had made Mark laugh. It had brought the dead back to life. Ghost rose from his cold corner. He was invisible. The fire was not for him. The rug was not for him. The laughter was not for him. He was no longer family. He was just the other animal, a relic. He walked to the door, pushed it open with his nose and stepped back out into the night. He did not go to the porch. He walked past the woodpile, past the end of the gravel, and into the deep, familiar shadow of the forest. The air was cold, and it smelled like pine and damp earth. It was the only home he had left. For 3 nights, Ghost slept in the forest. He found a dry hollow under a fallen cedar, a place that smelled of damp earth and old rot. He hunted, not for pleasure, but for sustenance. A rabbit, a field mouse. He was a wolf again. He was what he had been before Mark. And yet, he could not leave. By day, he would lie on a high ridge overlooking the cabin, a pale, unmoving sentinel against the dark trees. He watched Mark. He watched him chop wood, his movements still precise, but now hurried. He watched him carry the small, squirming golden creature in and out. He saw Mark set a bowl of food on the porch, for him, but he did not take it. He watched until the food was cold, until the birds came, and finally, until Mark came back out. His shoulders slumped and took the bowl away. The betrayal was a cold stone in his gut, heavier than any hunger. Inside the cabin, Mark was exhausted. The puppy, Buster, was a relentless engine of need. He was not like Ghost, who moved with the silent economy of the wild. Buster was a whirlwind of chaos. He cried in the night. He chewed on the leg of the workbench until Mark had to coat it in bitter apple spray. He was a full-time job, and he left Mark weary, with no time to think, no time to feel. But the laughter, the one that had broken Ghost's heart, had not returned. Mark's face was a mask of tired frustration. On the 4th night, the air changed. The familiar, damp chill of the coastal range was replaced by a sharp, clear cold. The moon was a sliver of ice in a black sky. Stars, usually hidden by clouds, glittered with a hard, indifferent light. Mark, exhausted, fell asleep in the rocking chair, the fire he had lit for the puppy burning low. Buster, full of a late-night energy, was not asleep. He was sniffing at the gap under the cabin door. Mark, in his weariness, had left the door just slightly ajar. Perhaps in the back of his mind, he had been hoping Ghost would come in from the cold. The gap was only an inch, but it was enough. Buster, driven by a puppy's boundless and foolish curiosity, pushed his nose against the wood. The door creaked open, just wide enough. He saw the silver-blue light of the moon on the porch. He smelled the new, sharp air. He scrambled out. He was not afraid. The world, to him, was a thing to be chewed. He tumbled down the porch steps, a small, golden shadow, and sniffed at the woodpile. He chased a leaf that skittered across the gravel. He was a tiny, defenseless beacon of life in a vast, dark wilderness. And the wilderness was watching. On the ridge, Ghost lifted his head. His ears swiveled, catching the small sounds, the scrape of paws on gravel, the playful, tiny growl. He rose to his feet, his body tense. He was not the only one who had heard. From the rocks above the woodline, 2 eyes, glowing a pale, cold green, observed the puppy. A cougar, a large male, had been drawn to the cabin for days by the new smells, the new sounds. It had been patient. Now, its patience was rewarded. The big cat moved with a liquid, terrifying grace. It did not make a sound. Flowing over the ground like smoke, its long tail low. It saw the small, clumsy creature. It saw an easy meal. Buster, oblivious, pounced on a pine cone. The cougar crouched, its muscles coiling. It was 50 yards away. Then 40. From his ridge, Ghost saw the movement. He saw the long, feline shadow detach itself from the darkness. He knew that shape. He knew that silent, patient death. All the pain of the last 3 days, the cold hearth, the empty bowl, the laughter that was not for him, vanished. It was replaced by an instinct far older, far deeper. It was not jealousy. It was not love. It was territory. That cabin was his. That man was his. And everything in it, even the small, foolish, golden creature, was under his protection. The cougar gathered its haunches for the final leap. Buster, finally sensing the change in the air, looked up. He saw the green eyes. He let out a single, high-pitched, terrified sound, a squeal of pure, primal fear. A white bolt of lightning exploded from the trees. Ghost did not make a sound. He covered the 50 yards in a silent, white blur, driven by 3 years of loyalty and 1,000 years of wolf instinct. He intercepted the cougar in midair. The two bodies hit the ground with a heavy, wet thud. The night exploded. It was not a fight. It was a storm of claws and teeth. The air was ripped apart by the sound of deep, thoracic growls from the wolf and the high, tearing scream of the cougar. The sound was not a sound. It was a violation. It was the noise of the world tearing apart, a high-pitched, frantic scream from the cougar, and a deep, guttural roar from the wolf that seemed to shake the cabin's foundation. Mark was ripped from the heavy, dreamless sleep of exhaustion. He sat bolt upright in the rocking chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. The fire was dead embers. The room was dark, but the noise from outside was terrifyingly real. His first thought, a confused, sleep-fogged panic, was Ghost. His second thought, sharp as a needle, was Buster. He scrambled for the door, fumbling with the latch in the dark. As he yanked it open, the full volume of the fight hit him like a physical blow. The night air, cold and sharp, was filled with the sounds of a desperate, violent struggle. "No!" he yelled, his voice cracking. He stumbled back inside, grabbing the old hunting rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace, the one he hadn't fired in years. He didn't even check if it was loaded. He just knew. He burst back onto the porch, his eyes frantic, tried to make sense of the chaos in the moonlight. And then he saw it. It was a tangle of thrashing limbs and fur. A single, monstrous creature of violence silhouetted against the gravel. The cougar, sleek and powerful, was on its back, raking its rear claws at the wolf's stomach, while its jaws snapped at Ghost's throat. But Ghost was a creature born of that same wild. He had his own jaws locked onto the cougar's shoulder, his massive white body shaking with the effort, refusing to let go. A few feet away, cowering under the porch steps, was a small, golden patch of terror. Buster. He was paralyzed, letting out a series of high-pitched, choked cries. The cougar, sensing the man, redoubled its efforts. It shrieked again and managed to throw Ghost off. The wolf hit the ground, rolling, but was on his feet in an instant, a dark, wet stain spreading across his white shoulder. The cougar saw its opening, not to re-engage the wolf, but to snatch the easier prey. It gathered itself, a low, menacing growl in its chest, and took one step toward Buster. "No!" Mark roared. He raised the rifle to his shoulder. He didn't aim at the cat. He didn't want to kill it. He just wanted it gone. He aimed at the dark sky above the trees and pulled the trigger. The explosion of the rifle shot was catastrophic. It shattered the night, a flash of fire and a sound that echoed off the mountains like thunder. The cougar, already on edge, flinched as if struck. The sound, the fire, the sudden re-emergence of the man. It was too much. In one fluid, desperate motion, it turned and vanished. It didn't run. It simply dissolved back into the blackness of the forest, leaving a sudden, deafening silence in its wake. The only sound left was the puppy's frantic whimpering and the ragged, desperate panting of the wolf. Mark stood on the porch, the rifle heavy in his hands, his body shaking with adrenaline. The smell of sulfur hung in the cold air. Buster, released from his paralysis, scrambled out from under the steps and ran to Mark, clawing at his legs, crying to be picked up. But Mark didn't see him. His eyes were locked on Ghost. The white wolf stood in the middle of the gravel driveway, his head low. He was swaying, unsteady on his feet. The moonlight caught the slick, dark blood that matted his shoulder and ran down his leg. He was breathing in great, shuddering gasps. He had not moved. He stood, a guardian, between the cabin and the forest where the cougar had fled. And in that moment, the cold stone of betrayal in Ghost's own gut was replaced by the cold, dawning horror in Mark's. He saw it all in a single, devastating instant. The puppy cowering, the wolf bleeding, the empty food bowl on the porch, the laughter that was not for him, the braided rug, now empty. Ghost could have stayed on the ridge. He could have let the cougar take the small, annoying creature that had stolen his fire, his rug, his master's heart. He could have turned and disappeared, reclaiming the wild that was his birthright. He had not. He had chosen. He had come down from his exile, from his pain, and he had chosen to fight. He had chosen to protect the very creature that had replaced him. He had chosen to protect Mark's family. "Oh, God," Mark whispered. The rifle slipped from his numb fingers, clattering onto the porch boards. Ghost. He took one step off the porch. Ghost looked up. His amber eyes, usually so clear and patient, were clouded with pain. He saw Mark, and for the first time, he did not look away. He stood his ground, bleeding, waiting. "What did I do?" Mark said to the empty night. He wasn't talking to the wolf. He was talking to himself. He ran down the steps, ignoring the puppy clinging to his jeans, and fell to his knees on the cold, wet gravel in front of the injured wolf. Mark's knees hit the gravel, the sharp stones digging into his jeans. But he felt nothing. The world had compressed to the space between him and the bleeding wolf. The adrenaline from the gunshot faded, replaced by a cold, sickening wave of dread. "Ghost," he breathed. The wolf's panting was shallow and fast, each breath a painful, ragged sound in the profound silence. The puppy, Buster, was still crying at his leg, clawing at his jeans. "Mark, Mark." It was a name, not a word, a desperate plea for comfort. Without looking down, Mark gently pushed the puppy away. Not now. His focus was absolute. He reached out a trembling hand, not to the wound, but to the wolf's great head. Ghost flinched, his body tensing for a blow that never came. "It's okay," Mark whispered, his voice thick. "It's me. It's just me." The wolf, swaying, let out a low, pained whine. His legs were beginning to buckle. "No, we're not doing this. You're not leaving," Mark said, his voice hardening with a sudden, fierce resolve. He slipped one arm under Ghost's chest and the other under his hind legs. With a grunt, he lifted the wolf. It was a dead weight, 120 pounds of limp fur and muscle. Ghost was too weak to protest. Mark carried him past the cowering puppy, up the porch steps, and back into the cabin. He didn't put him in the corner. He didn't put him on the cold floorboards. He walked straight to the braided rug by the fire, Sarah's rug, and gently laid Ghost down upon it. Buster, sensing he had been left behind, scrambled into the cabin after them, his tail tucked, his whimpers low and fearful. He ran, not to Mark, but to the rocking chair, and hid in the shadows beneath it. Mark didn't notice. He was in motion. The carpenter, the man of quiet routines, was gone. In his place was a man with a singular, desperate purpose. He threw logs onto the dying embers, the fire catching quickly, illuminating the dark, wet stain spreading across the rug. "Stay with me, boy," he muttered, running to the bathroom. He returned with the first aid kit and the stack of bear print towels, the same ones he had used to dry the puppy. He knelt beside Ghost. The wound was bad. A deep, tearing gash across the shoulder where the cougar's claws had raked him. It was bleeding heavily. "Okay," Mark said, more to himself than the wolf. "Okay." His hands, the same steady hands that planed wood, were now covered in the warm, dark blood of the only family he had left. He pressed a towel into the wound, hard. Ghost let out a muffled cry, his muscles tensing, but he did not snap. He just looked at Mark, his amber eyes wide with pain and a new, dawning confusion. For 20 minutes, the only sounds in the cabin were the snap of the growing fire, the ragged breathing of the wolf, and Mark's low, constant stream of words. "You stupid brave. Stupid wolf. Why didn't you run? You should have run. It's okay, I've got you. You're okay." He worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best he could, his hands moving with an efficient, desperate grace. He stitched the worst of it closed with a curved needle and fishing line he'd sterilized in the fire. Through it all, Buster watched from under the chair. He watched the man's frantic movements. He watched the massive white creature that had been so terrifying just moments before, now lying still and wounded. The puppy's fear began to war with his instincts. The cabin was warm. The man was there. The danger was gone. But there was a new tension in the air, a deep, pervasive scent of pain. Slowly, driven by a need for comfort that was stronger than his fear, Buster crept out. He moved low to the ground, his paws making no sound. Mark, focused on a final knot, didn't see him. Buster padded across the floor, not to Mark's hand, but to the wolf. He stopped a foot away from Ghost's head. He sniffed. The wolf smelled of blood and pine and the sharp, metallic tang of the fight. Ghost's eyes, half closed in exhaustion, opened. He saw the small, golden creature. A low warning rumble started deep in his chest. "No," Mark said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Stop." The rumble died. Ghost just watched, weary. Buster, misinterpreting the lack of aggression as acceptance, took 2 more steps. He sniffed the wolf's bloody paw. Then, in a gesture of pure, simple animal instinct, he licked the blood from the white fur. Ghost froze. Mark's hands stopped moving. The puppy, having done this, and finding the wolf did not move, felt a sudden wave of exhaustion. He was cold, he was scared, and this massive, warm creature was there. He circled once, a tiny, clumsy motion, and then curled up against Ghost's uninjured side, pressing his small golden body into the wolf's thick white fur. Ghost let out a long, shuddering sigh and closed his eyes. Mark sat back on his heels, the bloody needle still in his hand. He looked at the 2 of them, the small, foolish creature that had been the center of his distraction, and the magnificent, wounded animal that had paid the price for it. He saw the fire, the rocking chair, the braided rug, and he saw what he had almost lost. He looked at Ghost, who was now breathing more slowly, the warmth of the fire and the small, golden puppy pressed against his side. Mark reached out, his hand shaking, and laid it on the wolf's great head. You're not just an animal," Mark whispered, his throat tight. "You're not just a stray. You're not just my guardian." He looked at the small, sleeping puppy, and then back to the wolf. "You are family, Ghost," he said. the words tearing out of his chest, rough and unfamiliar. You've always been family. I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry. The wolf, in his pained, exhausted state, did not lift his head. But at the sound of Mark's voice, at the touch of his hand, his tail thumped once, a heavy, slow beat against the braided rug. Once. It was enough. Mark did not sleep. He sat on the floor, his back against the rocking chair, and watched the two animals by the fire. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the low crackle of the oak logs and the synchronized deep breathing of the wolf and the puppy. He had bathed the wound, stitched it with the steady hand of a carpenter, and covered it with a clean bandage. Ghost was weak, his body heavy with exhaustion and the shock of the fight, but his breathing was even. The bleeding had stopped. Sometime before dawn, Buster, the puppy, woke up. He yawned, a tiny, squeaking sound, and looked around. He was curled against the massive, warm, white belly of the wolf. He did not seem to find this strange. He simply licked Ghost's chest fur once, then wriggled closer, burrowing his small nose into the thick undercoat, and went back to sleep. A strange, painful knot in Mark's own chest, a knot he hadn't even known was there, finally began to unwind. It was a knot of grief, of guilt, and of a loneliness so profound he had mistaken it for peace. When the first weak gray light of the Oregon morning filtered through the window, Mark rose stiffly. His knees ached. He looked at the scene by the fire. Ghost, Buster, the braided rug. The fortress of his solitude had been breached, not by his sister's well-intentioned gift, but by the wild, desperate loyalty of the creature he had almost cast aside. He made coffee, the movements a familiar, comforting ritual. But this time, everything was different. As he poured the hot water, his eyes kept flicking back to the hearth. Ghost stirred. His amber eyes opened, clear and sharp. He looked at Mark. He did not look angry. He did not look betrayed. He simply looked. Then, slowly, wincing from the pain in his shoulder, he began to push himself up. "No, stay," Mark said, his voice quiet. He crossed the room and knelt. "Stay. You're hurt." Ghost ignored him. With a pained grunt, the wolf forced himself to his feet. He stood, unsteady, his bandaged shoulder stark white against his fur. He looked at Mark. Then he looked at Buster, who was still asleep. Then he looked at the door. He was a guardian. His shift was not over. You stubborn, magnificent..." Mark's voice trailed off. He reached out, not to the wolf's head this time, but to his broad chest, and just rested his hand there. He felt the strong, steady beat of the wolf's heart under his palm. "I hear you," Mark whispered. "It's okay. I'm here. We're safe." Ghost leaned his weight, just slightly, into Mark's hand. He let out a long, slow breath, and finally, his body relaxed. He sank back down onto the rug, but his eyes stayed open, watching Mark. Buster woke up, energized and oblivious. He saw Mark and scrambled to his feet, tumbling over Ghost's tail, and ran to the man, yipping and biting at his boots. "Hey," Mark said, picking him up. But this time, he didn't cuddle him. He didn't use the high, silly voice. He just held the puppy firmly. He sat on the hearth, the puppy in one hand, and with the other, he reached out and stroked the wolf's head. "So," he said to both of them, "this is how it is." He looked at the small, golden creature, a symbol of a new, noisy life. Then he looked at the massive, scarred white wolf, a symbol of a loyalty that ran deeper than blood. "You," he said to Buster, "are a handful. You're chaos." Then he looked at Ghost. "And you're the heart." The wolf's tail thumped. Once. That afternoon, His sister Laura's blue Subaru fought its way back up the gravel road. She stepped out, her face a mask of anxiety. I had a feeling. I wanted to check. She stopped on the porch. The door was open. She saw Mark not at his workbench, but sitting in the rocking chair. She saw the fire blazing in the hearth, and she saw the two animals lying in front of it. The massive white wolf was on the braided rug, his shoulder bandaged, and curled up against his stomach, sleeping in a patch of sunlight, was the golden puppy. Laura's hand went to her mouth. She didn't understand what she was seeing, but she understood that the air in the cabin was different. The silence was still there, but it was no longer the cold, empty silence of a tomb. It was the warm, breathing silence of a home. "Mark," she whispered. Mark looked up. He smiled. It was a small, rusty smile, but it was real. "It's okay, Laura," he said. "It's okay." He looked down at the two creatures who had, in their own violent, chaotic, and silent way, saved him from himself. He had not just gained a puppy. He had reclaimed his wolf. He had refound his family. And he knew, as he watched the fire burn, that there was, and always had been, enough love to go around. This story was about a heart that was broken and a loyalty that never wavered. What was the one moment in Ghost's journey that stayed with you? Even a simple word in the comments lets me know you were here. If you'd like to return to this quiet place for another story, please subscribe. We'll keep the fire on for you.